Welcome to the Wordy Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
Hello and welcome everybody to the Wordy Pair Podcast. As always, I'm Rudy.
Hello, I'm Justin.
And we are going to be talking about... How would you describe it? Basically the question of, should I start my story in media res, pros and cons?
Yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit about some of the things that are considered taboos again. Honing in this time on starting your stories with action sequences.
Yes. Which isn't quite the same thing as being in media res, but they're related.
Yeah. Do you want to start this one off, or do you want me to prompt us and we can take off from there?
I guess I'll start off because it's funny that you mentioned this thing of not wanting to start a story in the in the middle of action, where I was actually just today looking through a variety. I'm building basically a list of places that accept, non-agented people's publications for fiction. And one of the places I checked out was called... It's from ChicagoWrites.org, and it's the Write City Easy. Now, I haven't read anything that they've written. I haven't done anything. I just have been looking for these submission guidelines pages for various magazines and collecting them. But their number one story element that they want before you submit your piece to their magazine for consideration is, quote, your story begins in the middle of the action. So, whereas you said that you've had experiences or gotten advice from people that some places and some agents will strongly frown upon starting in the middle of the action or starting with action. It just so happens that I found one place that absolutely goes in the opposite direction as well. And it may be that this is one of those things that has changed over the past, couple of decades. I guess I don't really know. So, yeah, that's kind of my start. Where do you start on this? In the middle of the action?
Well, I will try to be fair on this, because if
Sure.
you look at it the other way, you have this one e-zine that's saying, we will only take you if you start in the middle of the action, which is basically the same kind of thing. Like, well, we won't... And to be fair, that is, certain magazines and certain publishers, they have a certain... some of them have certain types of stories that they want to present to their readers.
Of
so
course.
it's okay for them not to really budge on that. So I won't hold that particular magazine to fault. What I will say is, through decades of looking things up on how to get published and how to, what agents and publishers are looking for, the majority of opinions that I got over, actually a little over 2 decades now of looking into this stuff, is that a lot of agents won't even consider your story, or a lot of publishers won't consider your story if you start a book in the middle of an action sequence. Now, I understand to an extent why. There is a tendency, and if anyone who doesn't believe me, just go and find a fan fiction site and just read like 100. Out of 100 fanfic authors, there will probably be 2 or 3 good ones. So if you read 100 of them, you're gonna see a lot of this. People will start their stories with big action going on, wizards throwing lightning bolts, and vampires and werewolves. We'll get to that in a minute. There's a lot of things that people say about vampires and werewolves too, but attacking each other and just these big old incoherent fight scenes. And if you read enough of those as an agent, I could understand where you get one paragraph in And you can usually tell right away if it's going to be a good fight scene or not. So you might have the tendency to toss it in the trash. The problem that we have is we've come to a point where stories are oversaturated with things like opening and action sequences, and especially in the past 15 years, the whole vampire werewolf craze that should have been a good thing, but we can probably thank certain sparkly stories for making it a bad thing.
Yeah.
People have a tendency to say, no, we don't even want to look at that. And on the one hand, again, I understand, but on the other hand, it's kind of lazy and stupid. Because you're supposed to, when you get a submission for a story, ideally, you're going to want to line these up in a queue. And you're going to want to give each one a bit of a fair shot. Now, a lot of them are going to be very quick fair shots, because when you start reading someone's story and you're like, this is absolute garbage, out of 3 paragraphs in, and you're just like, no, there's no chance. That's understandable. I think a lot of what's happened with the agencies, or the agents, I should say, that are the ones who are supposed to be the middlemen that find you the publisher, they're just jaded and a little bit lazy, to where they might even have computer programs that are set up to look for taglines like vampires and werewolves, and especially those things in a romance setting.
Yeah.
I think we can all agree that romance.
I think we can all agree that we should all collectively shudder when that thing is brought up, but go on.
Probably, yeah. I think we can all agree that romance is really a big sector of reading right now. And
it is.
It's incredibly popular, especially among younger women and older women. There's probably some in-between area where maybe there's people that, there's definitely
women's.
Yeah, there's definitely women that are my age that are way into the fantasy stories and the Dungeons and Dragons stuff. I've met them. I've played Dungeons and Dragons with some of them. I don't know how it is in the older or younger generations, because I don't really hang out with those people. But it seems to me that there's a tendency for the werewolf and vampire romance thing to be overdone to the point where you can totally understand why an agent would want to toss that in the trash.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, we've talked already about how writing in general has become so saturated that, everybody is writing something these days, it seems. So you can understand how a limited number of agents getting an unlimited number of submissions and an unlimited number of requests for their time might get very jaded about, this is the 15th story this week that I've read that was titled A Blank of X and Bleed.
Yeah. What did we call it in the previous episode? An X of Y
story,
and B?
An X of Y and B, yeah.
and it's a little bit sad and frustrating. It's one of the reasons that I ended up doing everything independent, was because, well, I mean, for starters, one of my biggest stories is a story that is about a guy that stops a bunch of vampires and werewolves, and it opens with an action sequence. And there's no romance in it. There's no smut in it. There's nothing for the older middle-aged lonely woman to read in it, unless you just want to enjoy watching someone killing monsters and a little bit of justice. But the stuff that would get tossed in the trash, my story, which is probably completely different from all of that, would be included in that, because it opens up and it's like, oh, there's vampires in here. Well, I know where this is going. Kind of like how people treated anime coming off of the 90s, where it's like, oh, well, this is all porn, right? So I do understand where agents have fallen into this, but I don't understand how they're actually finding things that are making them money if they don't get into the weeds a bit and okay, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks. Okay, here I found something good. And I think that more often than not, we might be looking at, if it's not already happening regularly, if you submit something digitally, I wouldn't be surprised if agents have software set up that looks for certain terms and kind of filters what they look at based on that. Just like, if you're handing in a resume at a company for a job, They already do that for jobs. I wouldn't be surprised if they do the same for manuscripts.
Sure.
But what's the problem exactly with starting a story in the middle of a fight scene? Now, I think that there's a tendency to believe that anyone who starts in the middle of an action scene just had the action scene in mind and doesn't have much of a story to go with. But I think that does a disservice to a lot of people who understand how to hook readers into wanting to know what happens next.
Mm-hmm,
I mean, an airplane crash at the beginning of a story can be considered an action scene. And if you have
hold on. That's actually a really good point. So like, what are the other kinds of things that might be considered like an action scene, or as, I'll just use this phrasing even though I don't quite agree with it, as bad as an action scene at the start of your story? A plane crash, a car crash. So I'm from this. I'm kind of zeroing in on something, and I think the thing that I might be zeroing in on is that the result of a fight or a plane crash or a car crash might be a significant change in character. And if the character has no character before that crash, then you don't get to see how that character changed as a result of that event. And so I could see how that would be, a way to hide a bad character background. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You are pretty good at sliding into that little groove of the point I'm trying to make there.
That's my job. That's what I do here.
I was thinking along the lines of, you can have a scene at the beginning of a book that shows a person surviving an airplane crash and what happens to them during the crash and how that is going to affect them through the rest of the story. And then you can have an agent or even an editor who might be like, you don't need this part of the story. You shouldn't have it open on an action sequence. So instead, you just start the story telling your readers there was an airplane crash, and then picking up from there. And then you lose a lot of the things that happened in that crash that you wanted to flavor your character with, and you kind of have to wedge it in later on in the story. And if you haven't already, like if you're not going to rewrite the whole story because the opening needed to be non-action, then you really are just wedging that in.
Well, how about this as a contra idea? What if you instead added a little bit before the plane crash to give the character a pre-crash profile, character profile that people can see? Oh, Bob was X, and then the crash happened, and now Bob is Y.
Again, you've managed to wedge yourself right into that position where I was getting to, without quite so much negativity as I had. I was going to make the point on that if you have that situation where you can't start with the action scene, you are now you're jumping to the front of the story where there was no content that you needed because you wrote the story. It's finished, and this is just a one hang-up that your publisher has, or your editor, or whoever. And this hang-up causes you to go to the front of the story and add all these details that you didn't need before. Even if it improves the story or helps the story, think about what's happening there. This was content that wasn't part of the hook to the reader that you're bringing in. Now you're just putting something in front of them that is like the 10-hour tutorial in a video game that they have to get through to get to the part of the story that you wanted them to know and wanted to tell them.
So what you're saying is, if I can just summarize here, don't, under any circumstances, turn your story into Final Fantasy 13.
Yes, absolutely. I am 100% saying do not do that.
And not just for the copyright infringement problems, for the structural problems.
But it's more than that, because there's a tendency for people to think that being really flowery and having a lot of prose makes you a good writer. And I think I brought up before, I had a story by, what was it, Alexander Tchaikovsky or something. It was the sci-fi story that I read 100 pages.
The guy looking at the sun kind of thing?
No, it was
different story.
Yeah, I think it was a different story. It was about the spider people that evolved on a planet somewhere.
Oh, yeah, okay. You had the spider people that were evolving, and then they evolved some more, and now they're evolving some more, and then 10,000 years passed, and they evolved some more, and you were like, I don't.
It was
Where's the story?
It was 25 pages of these these homebrew spiders, these genetically modified spiders, and how they lived and what their spider instincts had them do, and then 75 more pages of how they're exactly the same, only more intelligent and more evolved now, and they're actually like sentient creatures with their own thoughts and free will.
Sure.
But the story there was no story there. Like nothing had happened 100 pages into this book.
Nothing had happened that was localized. Like, sure, these hundreds of thousands of these spiders are living, growing old, reproducing, dying, but you're not seeing any of the fun or interesting details of any of their lives. You're just like, you're looking at them from such a great distance that you can't tell the details of any particular, because maybe one of those spiders had an interesting adventure. He and that's occupied an area
bad.
and attacked a hobbit. I don't know, but
that's not a bad thing though. It's just that.
Well, it's just that 100 pages of it is probably a little excessive.
A little bit, and then it gets even worse, because at least there I was being given a description of a society. Like I would say that something like that would make a great like small novel on its own. But it was like I was starting the book with an entire small novel about this civilization, with the expectation that several, like 200 pages in, I was finally going to get to where, okay, here's something that actually happens with this race I've been telling you about for 100 some pages. Yeah. And I don't know. It didn't hook me because of that.
Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's, like the way that Tolkien did this was kind of brilliant, actually, is because he actually made appendices. He's like, here's everything you need to know about elven names, and like it's like just this big chunk at the end of the story, and you don't ever have to look at it if you don't want to, right?
Yeah, and some people do that. Where I mean, I've got several books where they have it at the beginning of the book too.
So the thing about it is that kind of sociological, like bird's eye sociological stuff is important for world building, but usually it's not part of the story. I'm kind of back burner working on a fantasy world, and I'm writing down all of this stuff about like, their creation myth or creation reality or whatever, the gods, the different races, the different places in geography. I'm writing all of this with the knowledge that it will never go to the public unless something I write that happens to actually be a story based in this world, becomes popular. Like,
right.
Like if the Silmarillion came out after Tolkien died. Yeah. It was a posthumous release by Tolkien. The reason being is that it's basically a history book. It has, the vague overtures of a lot of really cool stories, but there's very little, not very little, but there's a lot of stuff that just kind of gets third person bird's eye viewed away.
Yeah, and just as an aside, since you brought it up, I know that I am one of those people that doesn't plan anything and just sits down and writes, but that is not a bad way to write your fantasy story, is to actually sit down and write your own history book that you can do something with later on, just so you have everything that you want about your fantasy world to be set, and then you write your story, and you have your own reference right there whenever you need to say, okay, when you need to figure out what characters would do or what would happen in a civilization, you have and wrote the history book. It'll be pretty clear in your mind when you sit down to do that. So that's something to consider if you're one of the people that really likes to plan things out. We do have a lot of people who like to think that there should be certain rules. There's a lot of hardcore prose people who are like, no, everything needs to be this great prose. And it's like, yeah, well, I mean, if you want all writing to be boring, sure, cool. I'm fine with that.
Well, you can do some really cool things with some
very
you can. Descriptive prose. But at the same time, that kind of really, really detailed, like flowery prose requires too much of the reader's attention to go on for hundreds and hundreds of pages. Like, it's a great thing to put in your first chapter. To have like some turn of phrase, a bunch of turns of phrase that just, have the reader going like, wow, this is really nicely written. And then you get down to brass tacks and you actually start telling the story. I just read or reread Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke, and I was struck by the beauty of the language in the first, 10 pages. And then after that, he gets back down to normal, and he starts talking about characters as if they're characters. But, he spent 5 to 10 pages basically world building, but he did it in a really, really good way that it was so well written that I was even, surprised that it was written in the passive voice in a lot of places. I was like, wow, this is really good. And I'm like, wow, this is all in the passive voice, and yet it's still really good. But, if he had written the whole book that way, I would not have been able to, get through it and enjoy it the whole way through. It's a treat occasionally.
Yeah, there's several. Well, I can think of one off the top of my head. I think it's Ellie Modesitt Jr. or Modesitt. I don't know how to pronounce his name. It's Modesitt.
Yeah.
And he's one of the people that writes in the present tense, which I've never been a fan of, although he's written some books I like. Obviously, I think we talked about Solar Express once. That was a terrible book in my opinion, and judging by what people had to say about it online, most people agreed with me. It was, but he also wrote a lot of fantasy books. In particular, I don't think it was The Magic Engineer. No, it wasn't that. There's a book he wrote about a character who studied order magic, and in order for him to be very good at this order magic, he had to have a craft that he was a master of, and so he became a carpenter. And the better carpenter that he was, the more orderly his ability to put things together became, the more powerful of an order mage he became. And so this became important in things like creating his own staff. He had to create one that was very, I don't want to say objectively, but a very polished and masterful design that you'd have to be a master carpenter to build.
Okay, sure.
So that was an interesting concept, and I believe that most of his stories, I mean, that one in particular, I'm pretty sure started with action. I think Solar Express was just slow from start to finish, and it was kind of like a slice of life story without a point.
Which is kind of surprising, considering that it's called The Express.
Yeah, no. This whole book was basically people reading their email.
Oh,
it was kind of like a story. So it felt like it was going to be a story where you were in the place of a character who was near an event, but he was getting all of his information about the event through messages that he was receiving, and so the mystery was going to unfold, and at the end of the book he was going to be directly related to what was going on, except that part where he ends up directly related to things kind of never panned out. So it was just him reading his email. That's kind of what the book was. And it wasn't a bad book, it was just nothing really happened, which is kind of the issue. I brought it up specifically because that's my issue with people saying that they don't want stories started with action scenes. I mean, if you're turning away a book, especially one that's already been published, which means it's kind of been vetted already. Someone read it and said, oh, I think this is pretty good. Now, I know that these days that's a caveat, a pretty heavy one too, but it has been published. You pick it up off the shelf, you read the first couple pages, and you're like, ew, it's an action sequence. Well, I'm done with this. Unless you are the type of person who doesn't read action novels, like if your thing is romance or I don't even know, what doesn't have action in it besides romance. And romance has a different type of action most of the time. Most of the time,
I was just gonna say.
Yeah, most of the time it's really smut under the label of romance.
Right. No, I was gonna offer a little bit of a pushback there, because there probably are. So for any given agent, he probably has contacts at a variety of companies, and it may be that he just doesn't know how to sell a certain type of book to the people that he knows, to the people that he has contacts with in those companies. So I can understand, someone who, these are the people that I know at, Penguin, Bain, and Doubleday, right? So, and I know what they're looking for, and they're the people that I work with the most, so I'm going to, cater to them. You could say that that's a little bit of you could say that if he were to take on authors that he thought he couldn't market to one of the people that he knows really well, that he'd be doing them a disservice, rather than saying, I can't work for you, you don't produce the things that the people that I, sell to want to buy. That would be the better solution. But I mean, I could understand an agent saying, based on the people that I talk to in the industry who are making the actual publishing choices, I cannot accept this right now.
Yeah, and it actually, from everything I've seen, especially a lot of agents are on Twitter and talk about what it's like being an agent.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's the case for a lot of them. They know who they're going to go to.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that, over time, especially when a lot of genres have been pushed out of like Westerns aren't really much of a modern genre in writing anymore. Science fiction has definitely fallen by the wayside. Fantasy is still kind of there, but as we mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot coming out that is kind of Game of Thrones copycatting. And, God, I just saw another one the other day that kind of made me laugh. It was an A of X, an X of Y and B.
Yeah.
Title. I wish I could remember it. There's just so many of them, though.
I was browsing a few different authors the other day, and I found one author whose name I don't remember, but all of her books were titled that way. Every single one.
Yeah, people are becoming the algorithms themselves, and I used to think
at that point it's like, no, give me AI, please. I'll take that in favor of that.
Yeah, right.
Right.
You're not going to be able to tell the difference between the average writer and AI pretty soon.
Well, I'll tell the difference, but I might like the AI better if I'm just going to get this kind of, repetitive tripe from real authors. I'm being mostly facetious, but
yeah,
still.
no, I know.
Well, I'm telling the audience, not you.
Well, we joke a lot here, so again, we've always
if you don't like jokes, you don't belong here. Go away.
Get lost.
Yeah. Away with ye.
It's very interesting that things have ended up the way they have. It makes buying books at a bookstore, or even shopping for books digitally or online, you would think that these days we'd have so many more choices, and we do, but the choices all feel the same because people self-filter. And this is a thing that people do. We all know that everyone does it. We all watch YouTube, and we all watched when YouTube made the rules about swearing in the first 10 minutes of a video. Everyone stopped swearing in the first 10. I was watching grown men say, I was watching grown men on YouTube who are going to swear later in the video, say F it and F this instead of just saying the word.
So you know what the worst secondary effect of that was? All the clip channels became censorship channels.
Oh,
because their clips are less than a minute long, or they're less than 10 minutes long or whatever. And so they just cut so you end up with you'll end up with a clipper of someone who does use rather colorful language in their stuff, and it's just cut after cut after cut after cut after cut. And they either use a really obnoxious bleep, or they use obnoxious sound effects, or they just cut the audio entirely so you end up with something that sounds like
something's wrong.
Yeah, it sounds like something's wrong until you realize what's actually happening. Yeah, big secondary effect there, which I find hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, YouTube has turned into a middle school playground at this point.
Yeah,
it's so watered down.
No, it's. Middle schoolers are way edgier than what's actually allowed on YouTube these days.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I mean, that's what it feels like. It feels
more like a kindergarten.
It feels very immature. And
it feels very like all right kids, it's storybook time.
Yeah, and that's after how bad things got. Where YouTube, you and I were around when YouTube started. I'm willing to bet a lot of people that listen to this are
younger than that.
Probably younger than that, but probably, there's probably a handful of them that remember the beginnings of YouTube.
Yeah.
And it was people putting videos out that they thought were fun or entertaining to share with others. And every once in a while, one of them would blow up and everyone would share that one. And it was just kind of cool. And every once in a while, someone would find a way to monetize that. There's nothing you can look up on YouTube anymore where someone isn't, like, at the beginning of their video, they give you a very samey sounding headline for their video. Their title for their video sounds like everyone else's. It's like 5 of the best this, or you won't believe what happened here. The whole, what's the word I'm looking for here? That kind of marketing.
Well, I mean, I can point to a few exceptions. Like, for instance, the channel that we worked on together for a long time, the Muppy Hindgart channel.
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
We didn't have any goofy, samey intros on that one. We just got right into the mix.
Yeah, we kind of do that here too.
Well, yeah, that's the joke, but
but it's just it became this mess of everyone presents themselves as like a bit more professional than they actually are. So you got the guy standing in front of the camera, nice shirt on. He's all nice and clean shaven. He's definitely got his own mini studio set up in there. He's maybe even got a bit of lighting for everything. And he's like, he talks in that fake human being voice, that car salesman ShamWow voice of, I'm going to tell you about the five best yada yada.
Or either that or the injured, quiet person.
Yes, that too. And in either case, you get 2 minutes in, and then it's like, but before we do that, let's take a moment to talk about magic food.
Raid Shadow Legends.
Yeah, Raid Shadow Legends, or what's the food one? There's like a food one that's popular now.
There's a million food ones, so Factor.
Yeah, Factor is the one I was thinking of. It's going to be another one 10 weeks from now. And it's just, it's kind of jarring that they even put it where they put it most of the time, but I guess they got to put it somewhere. Maybe it's good that they get it out of the way right at the beginning. Nothing is worse, though, than you're 20 minutes in and they're about to get to the point, if they get to the point. I'll talk about that in a second. But they're about to get to the point. It's like they had this big, like, say they're going to, a big PC reveal for a new technology that is coming out, and they always say, like, oh, they always act like they're the ones with the first scoop, and you're watching this like, I know this person doesn't have the first inside scoop on
They're not
this.
an insider.
Yeah,
they're literally getting it from the E3 demonstration that was published to YouTube yesterday.
Yeah, but they're talking about it like it's this big secret that just dropped in the tech world. And then they stop right before the big secret, and they're like, Now, real quick, I'll tell you about my sponsor, and then I'll get back to telling you. It's like, no. I usually turn off the channel at that point because it's like, I don't need to know. It's not that important. If it wasn't so important that you could tell me up front, I would be cool with it. I get, again, that this is normie stuff. This
is the algorithm.
Yeah, normies are the ones that are like, I want to know what's going on. This guy said something cool is going on. He's going to tell me right after this commercial, so I'll stick through with the commercial. I don't know why that's a normal thing that human beings do. My immediate reaction is always, I'll go look for the information elsewhere on someone's blog or something. I don't want to
usually scrub through the commercial.
And then you never know if it's a 30-second commercial or if it's going to be 5 minutes of them talking about all the cool different ways that Factor gives you recipes to prepare
I just tap the right arrow until they're not talking about products anymore.
I don't even do that anymore. I look at the list below them, and there's usually a video that's also talking about that's shorter, so I click on that instead.
That's also a good strategy.
It's just, I get that people gotta, they want to do the hustle. They want to make that money. But you know what? I do this and I work a job. So get over yourself. I don't know. Seriously though, I mean, there's no problem with having your channel and especially if you are making money doing it, or if you think you can, go for it. But my God, I don't understand how advertising turned out the way it did, where people are willing to look so stupid for these advertisers. They do. They change the tone that they talk in when they start talking about the advertisement. They always have a list of bullet points. I mean, I've seen the lists where it's like, all right, we want you to nail this point and this point and this point, and make sure to say this one thing. There's usually rules they have to follow.
Well, that's just how advertising works.
Yeah. So I mean, it would be better, in my opinion, if the advertisers just gave these people their 1 minute commercial and said, here, just stick this in your stream somewhere. But
most
again, it's a normie thing where they want that personal connection.
That's the thing, is that there's so much parasocial activity on all of these streaming and VOD things, and most of the time what they're aiming for is they want the creator these people, they like hearing his or her voice, and so they're waiting for that, and so they want that advertisement in that voice because it's more persuasive that way, even if it's just the same words.
Yeah, I'll never understand the world of the normie, but
yeah,
I mean, I understand it, I guess, but I just don't know why that is a thing that works on other people. But either way,
Well,
everyone
it's a
to
thing
some
that
degree
works.
is
It's a thing that works
manipulatable.
better or worse on the margins,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's like, we've A/B tested this. When the creator reads it, we get 5% turnover, and when we have a narrator read it, we get 3% turnover. Well, that's that's a 40%. No, that's a 60% increase in effectiveness of the ad. So we're gonna do that.
Yeah,
That's just how it works.
it is, and it's a little. I don't want to say it's disappointing. I don't want to. I mean, it just. If there's one thing in reality I think that I hate more than most things, it's probably that. That's one of those things we're just stuck with. I don't expect it to go away anytime soon, except for, when people aren't making money from it anymore, which is, I feel like YouTube is gearing up for a big crash in that sense, but we'll see. And, I got so frustrated with it, I actually forgot what my point was. So let's move on to our sponsor.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. It's just you're watching a video trying to learn something, and then the person gets done with the commercial, and if you actually sat through it, as I'm sure most people did, because they want the knowledge that is in the video, and even though you can skip to it, most people will watch the whole thing just to be like, okay, maybe there's something important I need to know at the beginning. Usually not. Usually, and this really more than anything is the frustrating part. You will have a 30-minute video. The key and important and relevant and necessary information, the information that you actually need, is summed up in 1 minute somewhere in the last 10 minutes of the video. Everything else is fluff just to fill time, to make it a long enough video to where it seems like it's something that belongs on YouTube. And it's kind of like what we're doing right now. We could have just done a video where it's just like, you know what? If you have to write and leave your action scene out of the beginning to take have a certain agent publish it, you have to do that. But if you don't want to do that, that's okay too. There's other ways of doing it. That's kind of the point.
Well, the fact of the matter is that if you want to go through the traditional publishing system, you need to work toward what that publishing system demands. That's just how reality works. That's how you get paid for doing things.
Yeah,
is by serving someone. Whether you're serving them good fiction that they like, or you're serving them a tasty, a delicious Chinese dinner, you're serving someone, and they're paying you for that service, not because they like, the fact that you wear a certain brand of shoes.
Absolutely.
Unless you're Michael Jordan, in which case, then the shoes matter.
Just a little.
Quite a bit, really.
Well, yeah, in that case, very much. I think that, obviously I want to give more than just a minute's worth of content here. Like, we go over all sorts of things when we talk about this, because we want other people...
already did, yeah.
Yeah, we want other people that
good.
Listen to this to be aware that there's all these minutia to everything you do in all of this, but also it's important to know that you don't have to overthink it as much as we're doing for the purposes of this podcast.
Well, the purpose of us overthinking it is to give you a series of options so that you can choose from them more easily than having to think up the options yourself. We've already described one. Instead of cutting the action scene, you can add a little bit to the beginning to provide a little bit of pre-action character development. So let's zero in on that. What are the other things that you could do? Well, you could move the action scene a little later in the story, right? You could change the character's development a little bit so that the first few things that happen in the story normally, you pick them out. You pick out the parts that relate to what happened, what changes the character went through due to the accident, due to the action scene, and you put that thing behind there as well, as opposed to writing something entirely new.
You could turn the action scene into... You could be a real monster and turn the action scene into a series of flashbacks and have it conclude... run its course from the start of the book to the end and have it conclude near the end of the book. And then you could get yourself... Or even
just like in the first few chapters. You could do that. You could
No. You do it all the way, and then you get the Netflix deal because that's the Netflix formula.
Yeah, but we're trying to provide useful advice as opposed to...
Well, honestly,
if that's what Netflix demands, then maybe that's what you want to do.
That's kind of my point.
But you could spread it out over the first two chapters, for instance, or you could make the action scene a flashback.
Well, that's
and
what I
have it
said.
come
That's
a little bit later.
you have the action scene
No,
be a flashback
hold
over
on.
the course of the story.
I was trying to say something different though, so I obviously misspoke. No, you could make the the first things that happen after the accident a flashback, right?
Oh yeah.
Because you could say, okay, this is how I changed because of this accident. Now here's the accident.
I like to think that we're going to turn some author somewhere into a complete schizophrenic where he submits something that has an action scene at the beginning of the story, but he's got a file on his computer that says emergency flashback for beginning of story.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things, if you're going to try to write and if you're going to try to publish with conventional publishers, you're going to have to dance a little bit to their tune. I mean, that's the great advantage of indie publishing is that you put out the story that you want to put out. The problem is that, you can put out stuff that nobody wants to read, like I do.
Or you can put out stuff that is drowned in the sheer amount of... I mean, God, what was the last number I saw for how many new books get published every year? It was something like a couple 100,000, or maybe it was 1 million. Ridiculous. And it's just like, I know that most of that is garbage.
Sure.
I mean, it's not exactly a bad thing. I think... Of course, I have a complaint.
The point that I like to circle back to is that you, as the creator of the work, need to balance two things. One, the story that you want to tell. Two, what your audience wants to hear. And three, your creativity in coming up with a way to put together the numbers 1 and 2, right? If people don't want... I mean, imagine if we were in a world where science fiction was the big one and fantasy was the little one. Well, then you would write a fantasy story, but you would make it, a future post-apocalyptic fantasy science fiction, right? You would sprinkle bits of that in the beginning, which people have done. This is a fantasy story, but actually it's science fiction because it starts 140,000 years after the death of, such and such on Earth and blah 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 blah. The point is to use your creativity to mesh these two sometimes conflicting things together, because just to give like a bizarre example, not everybody wants a science fiction cookbook, so maybe you hide a recipe or a food reference here and there in your otherwise purely science fiction story,
and then tack the recipe on in the appendix.
Sure,
there's a
that
lot...
could be both really cool and really funny.
There's a lot of things that we talk
because think about the things that you could do with science fiction and recipes, because you could be like, oh yeah, you need yes, you need this herb, but it comes from this planet, so you're probably not going to be able to get any of it.
Yeah.
In a pinch you can use this, but it doesn't have the right flavor quite. Yeah, that'd be beautiful.
that actually would be a pretty funny cookbook. I think Naniog's cookbook, the Discworld cookbook,
yeah,
I think that has a few recipes where the writer did that.
Sure.
He mentioned...
I mean, it's so obvious that I thought of it in 3 seconds. Yeah. So yeah, other people have done it, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that's actually another thing. I remember when I was a kid, a very long time ago, yeah. I read something that someone had said, if you think you have a good idea, at least 100 other people have had the same idea. So when you're writing and you think you've come up with something that nobody else has ever done before, chances are you're wrong. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't write it.
It's not even chances are. It's just you're wrong.
Yeah. There's. I mean, okay. So like, what was the name?
It's not quite that bad, but like we don't want to go full postmodernist here, but like.
Well, no, seriously though, what was the name of that scientist? Or he was a mathematician who figured out the fifth axiom of Euclid's. His five axioms, where the fifth one was about parallel lines, and he came up with the idea of putting them on these on the curved spaces and doing geodesics and things like that. And
yeah,
but like when he sent this to someone he truly respected, only to find out that him and actually another person had already been working on this exact thing, and it was kind of something that nobody else was really talking about or working on at the time, and yet. This guy who sat down for years trying to figure this out, he actually thought that the person that he looked up to was trying to steal this from him at one point. But then even after that, like after he died, people found out that there was another guy who had been working on the exact same thing before he'd even started working on it. So you're never really going to do... I mean, if something like that can have three other people in the world working on it and coming up with it,
well, like,
chances are...
It's funny that this happens, but, like, Isaac Newton was contemporaneous with somebody else in developing calculus, right?
Yeah,
so
and
this is a really common thing. In fiction, this should not be a roadblock to you at all.
No, not at all. Because, I mean, if nothing else...
Or almost not at all. Because it's funny that you should mention this, because this was a couple of months ago, but I remember there's a particular writer who was tweeting about how he just discovered that there's an entire series of books based on the exact idea that he was working on a book for, and he's like, I have to rework all of this because it's not just close, it's like painfully close. And he's like, I never knew about these books. I didn't deliberately try to copy them, otherwise I wouldn't be telling you about it. But I just discovered this, and I'm thanks to one of my alpha readers or something, he's like, this is almost exactly the same as blah, and I'm like, the what now?
Well, yeah, and I mean, honestly, it shouldn't really stop unless he was writing something that was coming out word for word what this other person wrote.
It was painfully close, he said. Yeah. He's like, I could not in good conscience, publish this thing as it is. I need to rework it a certain amount so that it's not just exactly the same story beats in exactly the same world building with exactly the same types of characters.
I mean, The Sword of Shannara is a book that exists. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's not the same thing, because it's like a condensation with...
I mean, it really is kind of the same thing. That book is Lord of the Rings. It nearly... I mean, not verbatim, but as close to verbatim as you can get without someone saying, we got some copyright issues here.
Yeah.
I mean,
this character Samwise... where did the name Samwise come from?
So it's been a while since I've read it, so I couldn't tell you the exact differences there were that came up, but it was like everything was basically a mirror image, just slightly changed. Like, instead of hobbits, it was elves. Instead of rings, it was elf stones. They basically went to the same locations, but they were all slightly different locations. They all got separated in the same ways. It was utterly ridiculous how close this story was to Lord of the Rings, and yet, for my money, it was a pretty good book. The
Mines of Noria? I'm sure I've heard something like this before. The dwarf's name is Dimly. Really? Dimly?
I mean, Record of Lodoss War did...
I get you spell it with a bunch of H's, but, still.
Yeah. So we'll do the overthinking for you. Of course, do your own overthinking, too. The importance of overthinking, I cannot stress enough. People think it's a bad thing, but you're not really overthinking. Overthinking is a great exercise for creativity. If you sit down and question things from as many angles as possible, you can come up with some absolutely great stories, and you're almost guaranteed not to be accidentally writing something that's exactly the same as something someone else did. You'll always be copying a concept that someone else will be doing at the same time as you, unbeknownst to you. There's no helping that. And you're always going to be, you can come up with your own unique races for fantasy things and whatnot, but in the end, you're using some variation of either humans or dragons or some other mythical monsters. You can come up with your own unique things. Someone has probably come up with something similar. Mm-hmm. If you don't believe me, watch a bunch of the really bad movies on Amazon that are like C-list 2 and 3 star movies, and you'd be like, okay, this is a really bad movie, but this one idea in it that it was based around, that's actually not too bad of an idea, and it's actually kind of cool. Which, for my money, is the only reason those movies even get made. I can't imagine why else people put that much time and effort into some of the horrible movies I've seen. But yeah, you're not really overthinking. You're exercising your imagination. That's fine. But again, these issues of what you can and can't publish, what you should and shouldn't do, all you really need to know is that when we do this, a lot of it comes from we have gripes about things that are happening in the entertainment industry, and so we turn that into a podcast episode that goes over why we have that gripe and what it means. And all of the little nitpicky stuff about, agents want to do this or want to do that doesn't actually matter. All that matters is, what do you want to write? What is your best platform for doing it? How can you get it to an agent who will take it? And you're going to have to, again, you're going to have to bend a bit. You do not have to break all the way. And you have to remember that this is also not, it doesn't have to be like you versus them. There are plenty of people who have great relationships with their agents and editors and publishers.
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. If you want to actually make money on writing, you need to write things that people want to read.
Yeah.
And that's not within your control. With some very, very narrow parameters where it might not be under your control, in the sense that you find a hole in the market that was completely unserved, and you Harry Potter that stuff.
Yeah, and again, it's important to remember that in and of itself, it doesn't even end there. So you're gonna. I was watching a YouTube video where someone was talking about you shouldn't even bother being an author if you don't already have an audience, because that's the only way you're going to sell books. Well, I call bullcrap because I've seen it both ways. I've seen people who write the book first and then they find the audience for it. They sell plenty of books. I mean, I am not one of those people. I neither have the audience nor do I have people that even read the stuff I write. I just write the stuff. But you're never going to be stuck in a situation where you have written a book and you don't have the ability to go out and look for the audience after the fact. So don't let that weigh on your mind. Plenty of people have done it. Plenty of people have books that they wrote 10 years ago and then they finally find an audience for it. It's good if you have an audience. Is
that if there hasn't been wide exposure, then it hasn't been spoiled yet in any wide-reaching way. So like, yeah, I wrote Missed Contact last year, right? But like nobody except for the 6 or 7 people that read it know the twist and know how things turn out. So like if I can find a group of people next year who want to read that, it doesn't matter that the book came out 2 years ago. They haven't read it yet.
Yeah, think of things as assets. When you've written a book, think of it as an asset that you now have something that is a finished product that you can always sell a finished product. You don't have to sell it. It's not like technology where you invent something and you've got to get it on the market now because 5 years from now it'll be outdated.
Right.
It's a book. People still buy books from 300 years ago.
Right.
Bible is still a pretty big seller. Agatha Christie, also a really big seller. Tons of people from the turn of the century, tons of people from the 1800s. We still use maps from the 1600s. People still buy the old, I forget what it's called. There's this, it was this big book of maps from the 1600s that I believe the Spanish used. You can still buy that as a hardcover edition at the local Barnes and Noble. There's still people that publish it. You're not really sitting on something that you have to sell right now. So when you get the people that are like, get your audience first, their advice to get an audience is not bad advice, because if you have an audience before you publish a book, you have people that you can tell about it, and you have people you can sell it to. But you're always in a situation where you can start building an audience. And if you have a book that's already finished, you actually have a much larger grasp on where your niche is and what your target demographic is going to be. I don't know how any of this really relates to starting your book with action sequences. We went off the rails again.
It's one of those things where we start talking about related hooks and issues. And this is one of those things where people may tell you that a book is not marketable because of a certain thing that it has or doesn't have. And part of what you're going to do as an author, as a creative person, is come up with ways to make that so-called problem not a problem at the bare minimum, or a strength in the absolute best case scenario, right? This is what creativity is for, right? Just because you wrote something doesn't mean that you have to publish it the way that you wrote it the first time. That redrafting can make a variety of changes, from simple editing changes to fix grammatical problems, or all the way up to, oh yeah, I took this character out and put them over here instead. To, oh yeah, I didn't like this plot point, so I got rid of it and I put this in instead. And everybody has to think about this on their own value scale, right? Value is subjective, and certain things get people to plunk down their $5 or $10 for an ebook these days, and if you want to get those $5 and $10 ebook royalties, then you're going to need to do something about it.
Yeah, and
unless what you happen to have fits some pre-existing need that has no competition at this point, which is pretty rare in the world of fiction.
yeah, and it's kind of backwards thinking a lot of times for people to give some of the advice they give. Like, there's actually a okay, so to generalize, the idea that you shouldn't have an action scene at the beginning of a book might fit a
Yeah.
specific demographic that doesn't want that. But this kind of flies in the face of, you don't necessarily want everything you do to stand out. You do want to be able to sell to people that just want, a little bit of fun entertainment, but what is wrong with standing out? And so if your book is the one that starts with the action sequence and nobody else's does, and people occasionally pick it up and say, this is actually pretty fun right out of the gate, you're standing out. I don't know when it became a bad thing to stand out, but I can tell you that I am much more likely. I don't even look at books anymore if their title is an X of Y and B. I don't even, I pass them right up. So none of those people are getting my money unless like 10 other people come along and say, hey, I read this book. It's called an X of Y and B, and it was really good, and I think you'd like it. I would need like 5 to 10 recommendations at this point just to get past the title on some of those.
And you don't even talk to that many people under normal circumstances.
Yeah, so I'm not giving money to anyone that's publishing those books. I could probably be persuaded if it was someone I knew online that was publishing books, and I was like, okay, well, I know this person does cool stuff, so even though they've got that title, I'll give it a look. Like, I won't completely shun it, but for the most part, that's an entire category of books that I'm not even looking at on the bookshelves at Barnes and Noble, and it's a lot of books now. So the person who doesn't have that on their title is standing out to me, and they're getting my money, not the other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an important thing to remember too, is like, the older people are, the more likely they are to have money to spend on this stuff. So there's nothing wrong with chasing a younger audience. I mean, when I was young, I did spend a lot of money on books, but I also got, especially newer books, were usually gifts that were given to me for my birthday or Christmas growing up. Like, I only bought probably half of my entire Terry Pratchett collection, because every Christmas, and this was when Pratchett was still writing Discworld books, my parents would find one for me that I don't have, and they'd get me the hardcover edition. And so I just ended up with nearly all of them. And it's kind of interesting to see that, like, I've got such a gigantic collection of books now, and most of them have been bought used, of course, but like, I spend money on them is the point. And the older I am, the more discerning I am too, because when I was younger, it was just like, well, I've got $6 to spare, and this one has a pretty cool cover. I read the blurb on the back, and then I'm like, all right, I'll give it a try. And it's very hit or miss when you do it like that, and it really stings after a while when you don't have that much money, especially when you're younger.
Yeah.
So even if you have an audience of young people, if the older the audience that you're appealing to could potentially mean more money if you stand out to them. Because like I said, I'm discerning. I'm looking at these covers and saying, oh, an X of Y and B. Well, I'm just going to skip over that.
Sure.
If your target demographic is closer to our age, then you might want to consider how you're naming your titles a little differently. Yeah. And again, this is...
Or titling your names.
Titling your books. This is me... And this is the roundabout way I got to this, but this is me doing the exact same thing that I was complaining about at the beginning. I am telling you that you should title your books this way to appeal to me, and this other group of people is telling you that you shouldn't put fight scenes at the beginning of books if you want the agents to accept them. So this is kind of like a case in point where, like, this is reality. This is what you have to deal with. I like to complain about the fact that someone wouldn't put fight scenes or action scenes at the beginning of the book, because I really like action scenes. I write a lot of them. I love to read them. I don't think people do them enough. But that's kind of just summing up, again, this is reality. If you want the agent to accept your submission and take it to a publisher, you got to give them to some degree what they want. And I don't think there's any agent out there that doesn't have some wiggle room, because they don't want every single thing they bring to a publisher to be exactly the same and the sales start dropping off because it's the same crap over and over again.
Right.
So you can talk to the agents and be like, look, I've got this book. I want to include the action scene here. They might not want you to do it. It's probably even worse with editors, but sometimes editors get a bit too high and mighty with what their actual job is and want to tell you what your story should be. You can kind of ignore it from editors for the most part. You're usually paying them anyway.
Right.
But yeah, accept reality. Do what you have to do what it is you want to do with writing. If you want to be traditionally published, you're going to have to bend a little. If you want to do it independent, and this is an important thing that I don't think people realize, whether you're independent or traditional, you have to market your own stuff or get help marketing. The traditional publishers do help a little, but we're talking like maybe by the mid-90s, most of the work at that point is already being done by the writers rather than the publishers. And by the time 2010 hit, you're doing most of your marketing, even if you're traditionally published. And a lot of that is, and this is where this comes from, a lot of that is they want someone who has an audience already before they'll publish you in some cases. They like to see that, this person has a pretty high following on Twitter, so these are potential customers for this book. So if we accept their manuscript and publish their book, they already have 1,000 people that they can say, hey, I've got this book that I just published. Why not check it out? Publishers do look at that stuff now.
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't know, what are we going to title this one? Because we talked more about the realities you have.
Anchors Away.
Anchors Away, yeah, that's right. We're titling it Anchors Away. Sometimes you gotta hoist that anchor and set sail to uncharted areas to get your story published or get it in front of people.
Oh no, not Anchors Away, AWEIGHT. Anchors Away, AWAY.
Oh yeah. Cut the chains and
throw them out.
Be adrift. That's the way to be an author.
I don't know. We came up with the name Anchors Away before we started recording, and so I have to stick with the shtick.
Yeah. We're titling this one Anchors. What if we don't call it Anchors Away now, but we leave this in?
I reserve the right to do that.
I'll leave it up to you. You can flip a coin or whatever you want to do. My personal preference is we should go with Anchors Away, but it's the ball is in your court. The anchor is in your flotilla. The anchor's in your tortilla.
Ooh, I love tortillas.
Not with anchors in them. That would hurt.
Well, it depends what kind of anchor. If it was an anchor made of succulent steak, maybe.
There's not too many anchor. Okay, unless your plan is to toss the succulent steak anchor into the ocean and have the biggest shark available latch onto it and kind of just swim around in place, which is very unlikely. Not so sure that's a good anchor. However,
it might not be a very good anchor for a ship, but it's a great anchor to go on top of a tortilla.
That's okay. Well, that's also true. But I do want to point out that at least 5 other people have probably had that same idea. So
I'm sure they have.
So steaks away. I'm hungry now.
Steaks away.
I'm hungry. Should we end this?
Go get some food. Yeah, we can end this.
Good luck with everyone's writing.
Well, it's one of those things where a lot of things. I guess the takeaway that I want to represent here. Last thing to say is there's a lot of things that other people want you to do or put into your writing. It's up to you how much of it you follow along with and how much you decide to ignore. But instead of looking at it as like a roadblock to publishing, see if you can look at it as a challenge for your creativity. Because if you can come up with a good way to both produce the story that you want to tell and serve the audience or the agent or the publisher or whatever, then that might be a win-win for you. And that's kind of the purpose of creativity, is to solve these kinds of complex problems, without being too set on any particular, choice of action.
Yeah, and since you brought that up, it is actually a very good way to be creative, like you said. And also, you don't want to self-sabotage like I do a lot of times. Like I have done a couple things in my writing that I know nobody would ever want to publish, and I feel like some of it would grate on the reader, but I left it in just because I'm kind of a stubborn prick at times. And one of those was my last chapter in one of my books was a third the size of the book, and it was a huge book. So it was quite literally its own book in size.
Yes.
And I could have broken it up, but I was like, no, I'm just going to have.
You can say actual names, right? It's the
It's the last chapter of The Good Guy.
Last chapter of The Good Guy, yeah.
Uh,
and it is a chonker. I was at a scientific conference, and I was bored. And so I was reading The Good Guy. And I was sitting there, and I'm like, ooh, new chapter. And then it was like, who are these characters, and what's going on? And I was like, well, I'm sure that we'll figure this out in momentarily. And then hours passed, and hours passed, and hours passed. And I had to go to some talks. And then I came back. Another hour passed. And then finally, it was resolved moderately satisfactorily.
Right? So just how jarring was it when I changed all of the characters in that last chapter on you, and kind of
extremely jarring?
Yeah.
I thought I had a different book or had like skipped a chapter.
Good, because that's kind of what I was.
I was on my phone. I was on my phone, sitting on the floor in this giant room full of physicists, and I was flipping back and forth to make sure I hadn't missed a part of your book.
It was fun to do, because I had that feeling as I was writing it, like I want everyone to be confused when they get to this chapter, because I know how I pretty much knew how I was going to tie it together, but I wanted it to be a bit of a okay, something's gone off the rails here moment, and it was fun to do.
Well,
but
mission accomplished.
Again, kind of self-sabotaging in ways. Fortunately, it's at the end of the book, so by the time the self-sabotaging hits, everyone's kind of they're mostly committed to what's happening. So,
no, you know what you should have done is you should have made the sample part of your book from the middle, so that it includes that cut.
Yeah. It's like you start reading the book, it's like, when is it going to get to those characters that I was reading in the sample? What is going on here?
Right. Or no, I was going to say you could make the sample like have that cut in it, and so you're like, character set A, cut, character set B, and that's my sample, and you're like, wait, what? Why did you do that?
Oh yeah, because then it would look like one of those fantasy novels where they follow 5 different groups of characters around.
Yes.
Yeah, I did one worse though. Probably my worst self-sabotage was in Sylvia Saga, because I did this thing with a race of snake people invade Earth, and I have them hissing all the time anytime there's an S in a sentence. And normally the way you do that is you would write maybe 2 or 3 S's to show that they're hissing. I pretty much just jammed on the S key, and sometimes I had 4, sometimes I had 6. I had a lot of S's, so when you actually read what these characters are saying, sometimes it's okay, and other times it's just like, good God, how long are they hissing? And I just left it like that. I was like, I know it's obnoxious. I kind of want to see if because it's one of those things where a lot of times you'll put something into a book, and the feedback you get from your book doesn't reflect the things you thought people would talk about. So I kind of want to see if the reverse happens with this. I want to see if people actually point this out and be like, this is really dumb. Why did you do this? Or if nobody even brings it up. So I guess we'll see at a future date.
Yep.
But yeah, I totally did that on purpose, and I know that it's self-sabotaging. I know that it could potentially, like, if 100 people read the book, 70 might be like, he did this thing where every time these snake people talk, it was so jarring and annoying, and for that alone, I couldn't stand it.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Don't do those kind of things.
Don't do what Justin does.
Yeah. Except
do what Rudy says to do when Justin does stupid things.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, this is just like, my what do you call it? My credibility is just skyrocketing.
All right. Did we run the gamut here? Did we give?
I think we ran. The gamut.
I think that's the best advice we've gotten us for this week. So we'll.
Well, whether the advice is good or not, hopefully we gave people a little bit of food for thought, and because they'll have different problems to solve, but I think the overall idea of treating it as a puzzle and not a problem is probably a positive one. There's too many P's in that sentence.
I'm not too concerned.
I apologize for nothing.
I'm not too concerned about whether or not we're giving the best advice for people to use here, simply because I'm only still on Twitter, so I can see the things that writers are saying, so I have something to talk about here. So
yeah,
I consider that taking a bullet for the team, just staying on Twitter.
Uh-huh.
So I don't feel bad at all. No, screw all of you.
Yeah, fair enough.
Screw you, audience. Have a nice day. Anyway, now that we're canceled
right.
by sponsors and our
Yes.
Entire viewership,
agents,
editors,
readers, and writers.
Is there any? Does that leave anyone? Is there anyone we're not canceled by snake people who hiss a lot? They're cool with us.
Well, I mean, I have been playing a lot of XCOM recently, so I have been shooting a lot of them.
Yeah, but you don't have any problem with them hissing.
Sure, I do. I mean, I like.
All right, well, now we're canceled by snake people,
because it betrays their position, and I can shoot them more easily in XCOM.
All right, but that's a positive thing, right?
Not for them.
My point is the hissing is not viewed by you as an overall negative, and since.
Well, I mean, in the sense that I'm eradicating all of the hissers. Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a positive. So snake men that hiss a lot and probably hiss to the extent of 6 or 7 S's are the only thing we're salvaging from this, and those only exist in video games and stories. So
yes,
I feel like we've accomplished our mission for the day. And
yeah, I'd say so. Any day that we can reduce our audience to 0 is a good day. I would say.
I guess we can call it a week.
All right. Well, this has been another episode of the Wordy Pair podcast. I hope you enjoyed the bit of advice surrounded by a tortilla of tangents.
Or steaks.
And steak tangents.
Steak tortillas and anchors.
Steak tortillas. A steak tortilla? That's crazy talk.
Goodbye.
Anyway. Goodbye, everyone. We will see you next week. And hopefully you will enjoy our banter here, and hopefully we will have something good for you next week. So, as always, I'm Rudy.
And I'm Justin.
And we are out. See y'all later.
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cone. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.